Hello and welcome to your Week 8, Day 3 lecture. Please take notes today as this information will be on the assignment that is due tonight to Canvas by 8 p.m. Today we're going to talk about how to have a logical paper. We're going to start first by talking about the rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. Please do use these in your final paper. They're going to be helpful for kind of boosting your credibility. So the first component is ethos. Ethos is the credibility of the writer, the credibility of you. You are not yet an expert in your field, so therefore to establish your credibility, you need to cite outside sources that are credible on your topic. So if your paper is on, different parking structures on Cal Poly's campus, you're not an expert in that field, so you're going to have to find what other universities have done and cite those sources. That's going to help boost your credibility. Additionally, to boost your credibility, you need to have a well-written document. That's why on the rubric for every single one of the papers in my class, there has been a component that says, is your document proofread carefully? Do you avoid errors in grammar? And the reason for that is because the minute that you have an error in terms of your sentence structure, then your credibility does go down. Pathos is the emotional appeal. So some people think that there's no kind of space for pathos in tech writing. However, it can, if used effectively, it can really help establish the credibility, essentially, of your final report. In your final report, you're going to be appealing to the reader's emotions by creating urgency. You need to answer the question, why does this problem need to be solved right now? Because if there is no urgency, then the report is kind of useless because no one is going to kind of prioritize it. Last but not least is logos. Logos is the logical appeal of your document. And your paper will be logical if you do the following. There's a number of things to do to help boost the logic of your final report. One is to outline beforehand. Know that each section is going to be different and have its own kind of logical appeal, so you want to make sure that you outline to know specifically what's going to go in each subsection. Use only one main idea per paragraph. Provide a good use of headings and subheadings. Again, that's going to create a logical flow between your document, between your sections. Use transitions. And finally, avoid fallacies. So the rest of this lecture is going to be dedicated to talking about fallacies. Please do not use these in your final report. One time, a number of years ago when I was teaching fallacies, a student came up to me after class and he's like, okay, so how many fallacies minimum should we have in our final report? And I'm like, please don't use any. So in your proposal, if I highlighted anything in blue, that means that it is a logical fallacy or a problem in logic and you want to avoid them. So after this class, I would like you to pull up your proposal, look at those blue highlights and figure out how to correct them. So as I just mentioned, fallacies are errors in reasoning. They're errors in logic. You do not want to use them. I have 7 common fallacies to cover today. On the quiz following this lecture, you're going to be not required to define the fallacies, but you're going to be required to identify them. The quiz is different than most of the quizzes in my class. You're going to have as much time as you need to complete it, and you're going to want to use the notes that you take right now to be able to internalize what exactly these fallacies are. Keep in mind that there are a number of fallacies out there. We're only going to be covering the ones that I've noticed the most in report writing. First things first are hasty generalizations. Hasty generalizations essentially is when you make a claim based on evidence that is just too small. A lot of the times it can turn into sweeping statements with no evidence to back them up. So 2 examples of a hasty generalization that I would see is Cal Poly students hate the food on campus, followed by no citation. So when you make a sweeping statement like that, it becomes untrue the minute there's one student who actually weirdly likes the food on campus. So you want to avoid those kinds of sweeping statements. A way to avoid them is to use something called qualifiers. Qualifiers are words like some, many, a few, sometimes most. Anytime that you use qualifiers, it helps the logic of your sentence. So I do recommend using them and avoiding statements like all, none, all or none, excuse me. If you use the word most, please back it up with a citation. So saying most is kind of hard to prove, so you want to make sure you back it up with an outside source. Another example of a hasty generalization is the quote, "My English professor hates the class sizes, so Cal Poly needs to change the class size policy." The logic behind that is based off of one person's experience, we need to do the following. Remember, if you're going to make a claim about something, you need to back it up with evidence that it needs to be done. One person's opinion is anecdotal, and you want to kind of avoid those anecdotal claims. So I want you guys to pause the video right now and think about what is wrong with this sentence. If I were to see this sentence in a paper, what would be wrong with it? 75% of students at Cal Poly say they think the food at Cal Poly is not up to the standard it should be. So if I were to see that in a final paper, that is unethical and you do not want to use that kind of language. The reason for that is because it's based on a sample size of 104 students. Taking from that sample size to make the claim that 75% of all students at Cal Poly think the food at Cal Poly is not good is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. There's no way that you can infer that based off of a sample size of 104. So in your language itself, please, every time that you're engaging with your poll or survey, say 75% of the students surveyed to make it more logical. Moving on to the second fallacy, the false cause fallacy. Another word for that is post hoc ergo propter hoc if you studied fallacies in high school or rhetoric classes. The false cause fallacy is the mistaken assumption that A caused B. Rarely in life can we prove that one thing caused another, and a lot of the times you need to isolate your variables in a study and it gets really complicated. So to prevent this fallacy, the easiest thing to do is to just say there might be a relationship between A and B, or there might be a correlation between A and B, but please avoid the language blank caused blank. Correlation does not imply causation. So let me give you an example of that. The increase in the Cal Poly freshman class size resulted in, so that's another word for caused, larger class sizes, more police enforcement, and worse living placements. Again, that would be very hard for the writer to prove that in their paper, and so instead you can say there may have been a relationship between the two. The false cause fallacy can also happen in the future tense. So if you see, if we fix the problem with the noise in the dorms, students will perform better. You can't prove that. So you really want to avoid that kind of language. Instead, a simple fix would be students may perform better. The either or fallacy, or the false dilemma fallacy is another word for it, occurs when a reader builds an argument upon the assumption that there are only two choices or two possible outcomes to a more complex or gray area problem. An example of that I've seen in a paper before is we should keep Diablo Canyon running. So Diablo Canyon, for context, is the nuclear power facility in Avila Beach, or we will go without power. This sentence is illogical because it's ignoring the gray area of us getting power from things that are beyond nuclear. In your papers, avoid this language by simply acknowledging that there are more than two solutions to your problem and that you're just focusing on the top two best solutions. Slippery slope fallacy. This one is very common in the media. They really like this fallacy. The fallacy is that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to death, or something along those lines, when the original A is pretty small. An example of that is if we lighten the enforcement of underage alcohol use in SLO, vast numbers of Cal Poly students would start drinking, which in turn would lead to alcohol poisoning, binge drinking, and even death. So death is the last one here. It doesn't always have to end with death, but death is the last part of the phrase right here. And if we look at the original thing, it's lightening the enforcement of underage alcohol use. There's no logical I don't see the logic of saying lightening the enforcement of underage alcohol use and death. That's really hard for you to extrapolate. So just be careful to avoid the language leads to. A lot of students confuse the slippery slope fallacy with the false cause fallacy. The language of the slippery slope fallacy is leads to, and the language of the false cause fallacy is caused. Again, that will be relevant for your assignment in class tonight, but it's just know not to use either. And to fix this, you can say could lead to. Simple fix from there. The appeal to authority fallacy is next. So we already talked about ethos at the beginning of this lecture. You do want to use credibility and ethos. You do want to cite outside sources. Ethos becomes a fallacy when you appeal to an authority figure that does not have the authority on your particular subject. It's a misuse of ethos. It's citing someone who does not have the credibility to be an expert on the topic. So for example, a lot of the time students will cite someone like a doctor or a professor because those professions do carry a lot of credibility. However, be sure to check what field that they're in. If you're writing a paper on an engineering topic and you cite an English professor, the English professor, and I can speak from this experience, is not going to have a lot of credibility in the topic of engineering. So always look at your sources and look at who you're citing. A very common example of something that I see every single quarter is students who love to cite Oprah. So this was taken from a student paper. Oprah ranked Slow the happiest city in America 5 years ago, so why wouldn't you want to live here? Check that logic. Oprah does not have credibility to say why one place would be happier than another place. She just kind of said that as her own opinion. However, because she does carry popular credibility, a lot of students like to cite her. Avoid doing that. Second to last fallacy is the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is when you misrepresent the other argument. For example, so it can be the other argument, or it can be say an argument itself, so just an outside source. So it's misrepresenting an outside source, essentially. The straw man fallacy, an example of it, is people who don't support the minimum wage increase in Slow hate the poor. I don't see the connection here between hating the poor and supporting the minimum wage increase, and so it borders with some other fallacies. But then also, that is a complete misrepresentation of people who do not support the minimum wage increase. So to fix this, I recommend directly quoting your outside sources in your paper to prevent any kind of misrepresentation, or just be very careful when you choose to paraphrase. Your last fallacy is the red herring fallacy. A red herring fallacy is a distraction. So herrings, if you need a visual, herrings are really stinky fish that people, for some weird reason, like to eat in Scandinavia. When I imagine this fallacy, I imagine talking to someone and then they just whip a fish out and throw it in the corner, and I'm distracted by it. A lot of times when students use this fallacy in tech writing, it's completely unintentional. It means that they had a problem with their organizational structure. So for example, you might start a paragraph talking about one thing and then end by talking about another. And that's why I always say to have only one main governing idea per paragraph. So here's an example of the red herring fallacy that I might see. Cal Poly doesn't have time to worry about the food it serves. It's busy focusing on the environment. The environment all of a sudden takes over the sentence and causes the focus to be placed on that rather than talking about the food itself. So just be careful when you're outlining your paragraphs to make sure that you have only one main governing idea, and don't intentionally try to distract off of your topic. So that is all that I have for you. Now you're going to go to Canvas and find the assignment that is due tonight by 8 p.m. You're going to be identifying common fallacies that I would see in tech writing. Each fallacy will only be used once, so use that to kind of help you. You have an unlimited amount of time to do it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great day.